The cold Atlantic wind bit through the wool coats of the sailors aboard HMS Farnborough, a ship that looked, to the untrained eye, like nothing more than a sluggish merchant steamer limping its way across the U-boat-infested waters south of Ireland. Her smokestacks coughed dark soot. Her decks were cluttered with rusted cargo cranes and empty barrels, and her flag fluttered like it was tired of flying. Everything about her said she was no threat at all, slow, overburdened, and just begging to be sunk. But this wasn't a merchant vessel. Farnborough was a Q-ship, a British naval decoy with a secret purpose. Her job wasn't to transport goods but to be bait. The stupid-looking merchant disguise was no accident. It was part of a deadly trap, one designed with an intimate understanding of German U-boat tactics. Lure them in close, let them surface, wait until they were within spitting distance, and then unleash hell. Below deck, hidden behind false bulkheads and dummy structures, the crew of Royal Navy gunners sat in silence. Their guns were covered, their orders were clear: do not fire until given the signal. Most of the men were tense, staring at the floor, the walls, or the small round portholes that offered a sliver of view to the calm, cruel sea. They knew that at any moment the distant ripple on the water could be death or opportunity. Lieutenant Commander Gordon Campbell stood calmly near the bridge, a tall man with a hawk-like nose and an officer's posture carved from discipline and pressure. He had been handpicked for this kind of war: psychological, precise, patient. He wore the weathered uniform of a merchant captain and kept up the act even in front of his own crew when topside. Appear weak, appear panicked, appear doomed. That the idea behind coup ships was as daring as it was desperate. By 1917, Britain's losses at sea were devastating. German U-boats were cutting through merchant shipping at an alarming rate, strangling supplies. Conventional warships couldn't catch the subs, so the British turned to deception, build a fleet of ships that looked like prey but could bite back. Farnborough was one of the most successful of them. That 10:45 in the morning, lookouts spotted a small periscope slicing the waves about 2,000 yards off the starboard beam. No alarm was raised, no evasive maneuvers. The ship's engines churned slowly, still heading due west. They wanted to look as if they hadn't noticed. The periscope vanished, then silence. 15 minutes passed. Then a plume of water rose just ahead of the bow. A torpedo narrowly missed. The crew did not react. Another 20 minutes. A sharp metallic clang. The second torpedo struck midship. The explosion tore through the hull. A controlled detonation thanks to the ship's reinforced bulkheads and damage control systems. The smoke and steam billowed. A lifeboat was launched, deliberately sloppy, as if the crew was abandoning ship. Smoke grenades added to the illusion of chaos. Campbell gave the signal. Hidden panels on the deck flew open. Tarpaulins were yanked away. Men scrambled out, hands practiced, eyes narrow. The Farnborough dropped its act in seconds. Guns swung around, their barrels hungry. On the horizon, just off the port bow, the U-boat surfaced, its captain confident. His prey was finished. They hadn't even raised their gun yet when the first 12-pounder roared. Shell after shell slammed into the conning tower. Wood and steel flew in splinters. The submarine tried to dive, but it was too late. One round hit the hull at waterline. Another burst beside the deck gun, sending men tumbling into the sea. The U-boat shuddered, listed, then disappeared beneath the waves, sinking with all hands. The Farnborough, listing and smoke-wrapped, limped back to port under escort. She had taken serious damage, but she had done her job. One of the deadliest predators of the sea had been neutralized by a ship designed to look useless. That the Admiralty called it a victory. Campbell received the Distinguished Service Order. He later earned the Victoria Cross for his continued service in coup ships. The coup ship idea was controversial. Critics called it dishonorable war fought by tricks and disguises. But for the men on those ships, it was survival. They were not cowards hiding behind a lie. They were sailors turning weakness into weapon. And in waters where unseen killers lurked. Sometimes the best way to win was to play stupid. The victory at sea had cost HMS Farnborough dearly. The torpedo damage to her side hadn't sunk her, but the ship creaked and groaned with every wave, as if she remembered the violence done to her. Down below, sailors worked like devils, patching ruptured bulkheads, draining compartments, and rigging makeshift supports just to keep her afloat. But no one complained. They knew they'd survived what many hadn't. A U-boat attack. Lieutenant Commander Gordon Campbell barely spoke during the return voyage. Not because he was shaken, but because he was already thinking ahead. Each kill made the enemy more cautious. Each deception made the U-boat captains more suspicious. This game of cat and mouse wouldn't last forever. But for now, they had the upper hand, and that meant they had to strike again before the Germans caught on. Within weeks, Farnborough had been repaired, repainted, and re-outfitted for her next mission. This time, she was modified to look even more vulnerable. They added artificial cargo, raised false masts, and painted rust streaks to simulate wet. A new crew joined the ship, hardened sailors and gunners who knew the risks but volunteered anyway. One of them, a young gunner named McAllister, wrote in a letter home, "We don't fight in lines or trenches. We fight with silence, steel, and patience. One wrong move, and were fish food. They were soon back at sea. This time, patrolling waters south of the Scilly Isles, intelligence reports hinted that a notorious U-83 was operating in the area. This submarine had already sunk half a dozen Allied ships in the past month, always surfacing to finish them off with gunfire after torpedoing them. The perfect prey for a coup ship like Farnborough on a grey February morning in 1917. The trap was reset. The sky was overcast, the seas calm. The illusion of a slow, defenseless merchant vessel was complete. Sailors lounged on deck, pretending to scrub railings and move empty crates. Smoke trickled lazily from the funnel. Lookouts scanned the horizon with the subtlety of fishermen, not naval men. At just after 11 a.m., a torpedo sliced through the water. No one panicked. They didn't even flinch. It struck squarely amid. The ship shuddered. A muffled boom echoed through the decks, followed by the hiss of steam and the creak of twisted metal. This time, the damage was more severe. Water rushed into the engine compartment. Real flames burst from a ruptured oil line. Still, the crew carried out the same pantomime, running in staged panic, launching lifeboats with mock desperation, even tossing empty crates overboard to simulate cargo being lost. Minutes passed. Then they saw it, a periscope, slicing the sea like a needle through cloth. Then it vanished again. Then the submarine surfaced, bold and slow. Through binoculars, Campbell could make out the grey hull of U-83, her deck gun already swinging into position. Her captain must have assumed Farnborough was dying, listing heavily and spouting oily smoke. But the coup ship wasn't finished yet. Campbell waited until the U-boat was within 300 yards, practically pistol range at sea. Then, the trap sprung. The white ensign was hoisted. Gun ports flipped open. The hidden crew surged out like shadows coming alive. Boom, the first shell tore through the conning tower. The second struck the deck gun, killing the crew manning it. The third hit just aft of the periscope base, crumpling the submarine's spine. The U-boat tried to reverse, to dive, anything but it was over. In less than 4 minutes, U-83 was dead in the water. She sank rapidly, dragging most of her crew with her. A few survivors bobbed in the cold Atlantic, clinging to wreckage, stunned. Against standing orders, Campbell ordered them rescued. His crew dragged 5 soaking German sailors aboard, treating them with quiet professionalism. One of them, barely more than a boy, looked at Campbell and muttered in broken English, "You, not merchant warship, but look so stupid." Before being taken below. Word of the kill spread fast. Another confirmed coup ship victory. Another deadly hunter removed from the seas. But the cost was rising. Campbell knew he couldn't keep getting away with it. The Germans were learning. Every encounter made them more suspicious. And eventually, the U-boats would start firing from a distance. No surfacing, no warning. And when that happened, the age of the coup ship would be over. The celebration back at port was muted, while the Admiralty congratulated Campbell and his crew, awarding him the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor. He accepted it with quiet restraint. To the men aboard Farnborough, the medal was secondary. They had witnessed too much risk, too much silence, and the eerie calm of watching men die by a calculated trick. They weren't cowards. They weren't heroes either. They were something else, something harder to define. But even as London applauded, Campbell's mind remained on the changing game. German U-boat command had begun distributing new orders to their captains. The message was chillingly clear: do not surface, sink from afar, do not trust the eyes. The British coup ship trick had worked too well. Nearly 24 U-boats had been sunk by disguised ships over the past year. The Kriegsmarine was bleeding, and now they were evolving. But so was Campbell. He was assigned a new ship, HMS Gast, another modified merchant steamer designed to look even more laughably harmless. Her deck sagged. Her lifeboats were half-hung as if someone had forgotten to finish the job. Her flag was frayed. She looked like she couldn't outrun a seagull, but beneath the wooden crates and rust-stained hull were the same lethal secrets. The mission was now even more dangerous. Most U-boats had adapted and would not surface unless absolutely sure. Campbell needed them to surface. He needed to draw them close enough to strike. That meant increasing the stakes. He devised what would later be called the Panic Party, a small, hand-picked group of crewmen trained to fake sheer terror and abandonment. When a torpedo struck, this group would act out a convincing retreat, making it appear as though the ship was finished. Its crew disorganized and desperate. They would launch lifeboats, scream, abandon their weapons, and hopefully fool the Germans into coming up to finish the job with deck guns. It was a terrible gamble, and on June 7, 1917, Pargast rolled the dice. She was sailing near the coast of Ireland when, just after midday, a torpedo struck her starboard bow. The explosion sent a column of water and metal high into the air. The ship shuddered violently. Crates flew. Smoke billowed. Water poured in. The panic party leapt into action. They flailed across the deck, yelling, stumbling into each other, tossing ropes, lowering lifeboats with deliberate clumsiness. 2 men even jumped into the sea, clinging to debris to sell the illusion. One lifeboat drifted visibly, filled with terrified sailors waving frantically. Meanwhile, below deck, gun crews sat in utter silence. They sweated in the darkness, watching the water rise through narrow cracks. Fingers were on triggers. Every eye was on the periscope feed wired to the hidden compartment. One wrong twitch from the enemy and the game was over. 20 minutes passed. Then it appeared, UC-29. A small but experienced German submarine surfaced 400 yards off the stern. Her deck gun began to turn. Her commander had clearly taken the bait before he could fire a single shot. Pargast exploded into life. The gun ports flew open. The British flag rose, and every hidden barrel turned as one. The first shell decapitated the periscope. The second tore through the forward casing. More shells followed, in rapid, brutal succession. The submarine tried to dive, but one of the final shots pierced her just below the WATERLINE. The sea swallowed her whole. Campbell's men recovered only a few survivors. Most went down with their ship. It was another Q-ship victory, but this one came with a grim revelation. They had been seconds, maybe less, from being outgunned. The Germans weren't falling for the act as is, and Campbell himself was beginning to sense something worse. A fatigue creeping into his crew, a spiritual erosion. One sailor remarked to him that evening, "Feels like we're not fighting men anymore, sir. We're fishing for them, and we smile when the hook lands." Campbell didn't reply. He simply looked out at the quiet ocean, knowing that sooner or later, the fish would stop biting. The sea was starting to change, not in color or tide, but in temperament, in the way it received ships like Pargast now. The deception that had once been thrilling, even effective, had turned into something colder, heavier. Every time a torpedo struck, Campbell didn't think of victory anymore. He thought of the silence that would follow. Not the quiet of a sea gone calm, but the kind that fills a room when men stop coming back. The crew of Pargast had become quiet too. The tension in their mess hall was thicker than the soup. They didn't talk much. When they did, it was in mutters, about the Germans whizzing up, about how close they'd come last time, about the way the enemy was no longer surfacing like fools. They were learning fast. The Admiralty knew it too. By late summer 1917, most cruise ships were being phased out. Submarine warfare had entered a new era. No more surfacing, no more dead gun finishes, just silent death from distance. Campbell knew it was only a matter of time before the cruise ship concept was obsolete. But before it ended, the sea had one more trap to offer, one final deception. Campbell was transferred again, this time to HMS Dunraven, another converted collier. She was an even worse decoy than Pargast, slower, older, nearly falling apart at the seams. She didn't look like a target, she looked like a curse waiting to be sunk, which made her perfect. The mission was the same: patrol the western approaches, draw a U-boat close, and spring the trap. But by now, U-boat commanders had become more cautious, and Dunraven's chances were slim. On August 8, 1917, in the waters off Ushant, France, Dunraven finally met her match. The enemy was UC-7, one of Germany's most aggressive submarines. The attack came swiftly. A torpedo slammed into the aft of Dunraven, igniting stored ammunition and setting the stern ablaze. Flames ripped through the rear deck, and the panic party launched into their roles with more realism than they ever wanted. It wasn't just a performance this time. The fire was real. Men were actually injured. Campbell stood calmly on the bridge amid the chaos. Smoke blackened his face. His uniform was scorched. Still, he waited, knowing the U-boat was watching. For 30 minutes, UC-271 circled at periscope depth, hesitant. Perhaps they sensed the trick, but finally, they surfaced. Emboldened by the fire and lifeboats, that was Campbell's moment. The gunners, suffering burns and choking on smoke, manned their stations. One gun had already been destroyed. Another was jammed. Still, they fired slowly, but deliberately. The shots missed. The submarine responded with precision shellfire, striking Dunraven again. This time the engine room was hit. The fires grew. The forward gun crew was blown apart. Campbell refused to abandon ship, even when the fire reached the magazine, even when the bulkhead screamed under the pressure. He stayed, not out of madness, but determination. The signal to abandon was not given. He hoped, prayed even, that the U-boat would come close enough for one good shot. It never did. UC-71 slipped beneath the waves again, unharmed. Dunraven burned until the sea took her. When the survivors were rescued the next morning, Campbell sat quietly among the wounded, soot covering his face. He had lost his ship, lost good men, and gained nothing in return. And still, when the Admiralty reviewed the action, they recommended him again, not for success this time, but for sheer resolve, for refusing to abandon the deception until the last possible breath. The war was changing. Submarines now fought like ghosts, striking from the shadows and vanishing before you could see their wake. The age of cruise ships of clever disguises and staged chaos was ending. They had served their purpose in the bloodied opening chapters of anti-submarine warfare. But the ocean had moved on, and the hunters had learned to stop trusting bait that looked too stupid to survive. By the time the smoldering wreck of HMS Dunraven was swallowed by the Atlantic, The myth of the invincible coup ship had all but disintegrated. What had once been hailed as British ingenuity, deception turned into a deadly weapon, was now seen by many as a last desperate gasp against a type of war that refused to be fair. The Germans had learned they no longer played along, and without their cooperation, coup ships were just slow, weak merchant vessels, with brave men hiding behind thin walls and fake crates, waiting to die. Lieutenant Commander Gordon Campbell knew it. He had seen it happen in stages. The first kills had come easy. Back then, U-boat captains were arrogant, used to toying with helpless cargo ships. They'd surface, get close, laugh at the crew as they climbed into lifeboats. That arrogance had fed the coup ship's early success, but arrogance had been replaced by paranoia, and with Dunraven gone, Campbell began to feel something he'd rarely allowed himself doubt. Not in his duty, not even in the value of what he and his men had done, but in the system that kept sending men like him out into the sea with little more than hope in hollow barrels. Despite the Dunraven disaster, Campbell returned to sea. The Admiralty still saw him as an asset, not just for his experience, but because the public loved him. Newspapers called him the master of deception, the captain who fooled the Kaiser. They printed heroic sketches of him standing tall on smoke-covered decks, staring down the enemy with unshakable resolve. But Campbell didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man, burying ghosts at sea. One of his last commands during the war was aboard HMS Bluebell, another coup ship hastily outfitted for one last mission. But even then, by late 1917, coup ships were being withdrawn from service one by one. Losses were too high, the enemy had adapted, and public opinion was beginning to shift. Was it really honorable, they asked, to fight behind disguises? Was it war, or was it entrapment? The Germans certainly didn't see it as fair. In fact, captured U-boats crews often reacted with hatred, even disgust, when they realized they'd been tricked by a coup. Some even accused the British of violating the spirit of naval warfare, of murdering under false flags. In Berlin, propaganda posters showed British sailors as cowards in masks, hiding behind merchant sails to ambush brave and noble submarines. It was ironic, considering the U-boats were drowning civilian cargo ships by the hundreds. But in war, no side ever sees itself as the villain. Campbell was promoted, eventually reaching the rank of admiral, but even he privately acknowledged that the Kusha program had passed its expiration date. The Royal Navy had shifted focus to more effective countermeasures, depth charges, improved sonar, and convoy escorts. The age of decoy warfare was over. Years after the war, in a rare interview, Campbell was asked whether he would do it all again. He paused for a long time. Then he said, "If you asked me that during the first kill, I'd have said yes with pride. If you asked me after the last, I'd ask you how many of those boys I get to bring back this time." He kept his medals, but never displayed them. The Victoria Cross, the Distinguished Service Order, bars for bravery. He kept them in a drawer, not because he was ashamed, but because he knew what they had cost. The story of the coup ships, and of Campbell in particular, faded into a footnote in naval history, overshadowed by battleships, by convoys, by radar and aircraft. But in that narrow window of the war, when the sea was lawless and U-boats prowled with impunity, a handful of stupid-looking ships held the line not with firepower, but with deception, and the men aboard them knew full well that every torpedo aimed their way might be their last. They didn't expect to come home. They expected to fool the enemy just once more, and if that meant burning, sinking, drowning, but taking a predator with them, then so be it. Because in a war where monsters hunted without warning, sometimes the only way to survive was to wear a mask and smile through the flames. Long after the war ended, long after the newspapers stopped printing stories of heroism at sea, and the flags had been folded and stored away, the legend of the coup ships lingered like the last echo of a dying era. Their tactics had become a historical curiosity, their exploits reduced to training manuals and footnotes. But among naval circles, the old sailors, the historians, the few who still remembered names like Farnborough, Pargast, and Dunraven still stirred something deep, something conflicted. For every kill they'd made, a price had been paid in secrecy, in sacrifice, and in silence. Gordon Campbell himself carried that weight until the end of his days. He retired from active service with honor, having served in both world wars. His name etched into the quiet corridors of the Admiralty like a ghost, spoken with admiration but rarely discussed in full, not because his actions were questioned, but because they belonged to a time so brutal, so strange, that even the military preferred to look forward rather than back. He never wrote a memoir, though he was asked many times. He refused book deals, turned down interviews, and only spoke about his experiences in private conversations, often brief, always understated. On one such account, preserved in a letter to a fellow officer, Campbell wrote, "We were not brave. We were actors with gunpowder. And when the curtain dropped, the applause was silence. What we did because no one else could." Or would. The surviving members of his Q-ship crews went on with their lives as best they could. Some became fishermen again, others dockhands, and a few went back to sea with the merchant navy, but there was always a distance in their eyes. a quiet discomfort at the edge of every conversation. The war had turned them into something few could understand. Not heroes, not villains, just men who wore the mask of weakness so convincingly, they sometimes forgot where the act ended and they began. Decades later, when Britain held its commemorations of World War I, there was no grand monument for the Kush, no marble statue of Farnborough firing her first fatal shot, no plaque honoring the panic parties. Their sacrifice didn't fit neatly into the public image of the war, not like the trenches, or the Somme, or the poppies. But in 1930, a small ceremony was held in Chatham Naval Dockyard. A few of the remaining crew from Campbell's missions gathered there, older now, most with walking sticks or silver in their hair. They shared stories over weak tea, laughed at memories that once made them shiver, and when the sun began to set, they stood for a single minute of silence, not for the enemy, not for the medals, but for the ones who never made it back, who played the part so well. They went down with the ship. In the end, the story of the coup ships, especially Farnborough's, wasn't just about clever warfare. It was about what war demands from men when conventional fighting fails. It was about bluffing death until death finally called the bluff. It was about making the enemy underestimate you, even if that meant making the world do the same. And perhaps most of all, it was about understanding that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is pretend to be weak, just long enough to strike, because in the deep silence of war at sea, where no one hears the cries and every splash could mean the end, victory didn't always come with honor. Sometimes it came dressed in soot, with a limp flag and a lifeboat while the gun crews held their breath below the boards. Waiting, listening, and preparing to turn the stupidity of their disguise into one final, unforgettable kill.